Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for today, Tuesday, April 28th, 2020. My name is Tom Luongo. This is episode 31, and I have the very great pleasure this morning of having Patrick Heningsen from 21 Wire with me today. Patrick is somebody who I've been told from many people, including Whitney Webb and others, that this is a guy I need to meet. So I thought, hey, sounds like a perfect opportunity. If I'm going to meet somebody for the first time, let's do it in public because, well, you know, if it bombs, it'll be good radio. And if it doesn't bomb, well, maybe it will still be good radio. Today, we're going to talk about the civilizational effects of COVID-19 and why it's obvious at this point that anybody who is still in favor of locking people down have become, for lack of a better term, folks, economic and civilizational vandals, and they don't realize it yet. And they've let their fear get the best of them. And it's time for us to go over the brass tacks as to why this policy needs to end and why we need to really hold their feet to the fire going forward, and what the long-term effects of this are going to be. So without any further ado, Patrick, welcome to the show. Welcome to my world, and let everybody know what your gig is, man.
Well, thanks for the invite, Tom. Of course, I'm familiar with your work, and I appreciate the chance to have this conversation. So I'm editor and founder of 21st Century Wire, and also the host of the Sunday Wire. We've been our 6th year weekly radio show, but also have done freelance analysis for some international English language news networks like RT International and a number of other networks. As well, and journals. And I've just recently graduated with a master's degree in international relations from the University of Plymouth in the UK.
Wow. Very, very cool. So now that we've got the introductions out of the way, let's get into it. So for me, I've been skeptical of the whole COVID-19 thing from the beginning, but publicly I refuse to air that skepticism, other than to say, hey, maybe the government is overreaching early in stages of this. But I was more than willing early on to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. Now, every time I've ever done so in my life, these people have made me look like a jackass, because they are actually more evil and more depraved than you ever give them credit for. And they use our own willingness to be reasonable against us. And I think they've done that in spades here with COVID-19. So what I throw out to you this morning to start out this thing is, why in God's green earth would the leaders, the intellectual leadership of immunology in this world argue to lock everybody down to fight a virus that can only be fought with herd immunity? And that I still can't wrap my head around that, and why anybody would actually consider that to be a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, well, there was a number of fundamental questions that, for me, popped up right when this crisis looked like it was going to fundamentally alter our way of life, our economy, our politics in the West, and anytime the state undertakes a major decision, at least I can speak from the experience of living in a so-called democracy, or different democracies. I've lived in different countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, and also in the Middle East, different forms of government. But when you have that decision to fundamentally alter how society is going to be functioning, fundamentally alter the economy, social stratas, literally overnight, like when you declare war against somebody and it's going to be a long drawn out conflict, at least minimum of a year or two. Mm-hmm. And this is going to radically change everybody's life and the course of history for the country potentially. There's a number of fundamental questions that you have to ask. One is, can you verify the threat level? This is really important, because governments make these decisions every day since the beginning of time. Monarchs made these decisions. Kings, queens, everybody makes these decisions, these calculus of, you got to measure the threat level, and then you allocate resources according to the priority of where that threat level lies on a matrix of multiple threats. If you have a country, there's multiple threats that you have to consider if you're running the country. Terrorism, environmental threats, acts of nature, volcanoes, earthquakes, immigration, pandemics is one of those. Okay, so if it's a pandemic or an epidemic, the government already has an actuary system to determine how to deal with infectious diseases. These aren't new.
Right.
So there's already a process in place. States of emergency, how to triage, how to quarantine. So this is already in place. For some strange reason, the rule book has been rewritten, and there's been a complete dismissal of real hundreds of years of epidemiological science,
Right.
And wisdom that we've built up over centuries in terms of plagues, pandemics, how to deal with these things in terms of how do you measure this in terms of your healthcare capacity, for instance, because that seems to be that was the raison d'etre of the state was we need to protect our healthcare capacity so it's not, quote, overrun. That's the main reason for this lockdown policy. And so what is the level of the threat? Well, how deadly is COVID-19? What do we really know? What did we know? And all we had to really look at was the Hubei province in China. That was kind of a case study that was sort of wrapped and ready to go by, say, the middle of March. And then you had the unfolding crisis in Italy and Spain being the sort of the worst, most chronic European states at that time. So I'm speaking from a UK perspective and also from a US perspective because we sort of jumped the shark at about the same time. And we really didn't have the data. We didn't have the data, and you just had to. You have to make the decision. If you can't measure the threat, then you don't know what resources to allocate against it. When you're talking about pulling the plug on the economy, and those of us who pay attention to economic events, the reason I got very active into journalism was just besides the wars and everything, the thing that really shocked me was in 2008. And I remember it was the heat of the 2008 presidential race. It was John McCain running against Barack Obama. They were both hard on the campaign trail in September. And what did they do? They both left the campaign trail of the 28 presidential election, and they went to Congress to go lobby each side of the aisle to accept a bailout for Wall Street. This is after the collapse of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And at that point, and I saw it failed on the first go.
Yep.
And then we heard from Congressman Brad Sherman. It's probably the best thing Brad Sherman ever did in his whole career, as he stood up on the floor of the House and he told everybody what happened with Hank Paulson going around in closed-door sessions threatening everybody. There's going to be blood on the streets, martial law, and all the rest of it. And Obama and McCain were lobbying for this bailout, and Congress rejected it. It came back a few days later, and they passed it by a slim enough margin, and that fundamentally altered the economic destiny of the U.S. and also the world. The contagion reached Europe as well, but it set a very dangerous precedent. It was a marriage of government with Wall Street at that time. So from there, you realized the economic damage that came from that, and how many businesses were hurt and lives were changed. This is that times 100 terms of, you can scale it up easily 100, maybe more. And so no one's asking this question. So how can you make that decision on behalf of your population as a state with no data?
Yep.
And then basic science comes into play. And I know you have a background in chemistry and you understand statistics. Well, even if you don't, a lot of people thought mass testing, you need to do what the South Koreans were doing, mass testing, the Taiwanese contact tracing, etc. is what the Chinese were also ramping this up. But what really should have been doing is random sample testing to parts of the population to get an idea of wherever you are in whatever population or state, in various demographics and regions and different, urban, rural, elderly, school kids, to do random sample testing and basically do an estimate of the infection rate. And then you'll be able to very quickly, hopefully, understand the case fatality rate as it stands going forward. Then you can make informed decisions about what to do. And that's always been what's been done for epidemics. That's always been a standard operating procedure. Why wasn't that done? It's only been done in the last couple of weeks.
I know.
And so I knew something was wrong here. There's huge decisions being made, and at that point you have to understand and realize that there must be other agendas that are driving the policy decisions. Mm-hmm. And then that's when an investigative journalist has to go and dig and find out, who has vested interests either ideologically, philosophically, or economically or politically in a lockdown situation. Who's going to benefit the most? And so that was the first big red flag. And I didn't see anybody else really asking these questions that much. We were asking them. The UK column, who I also present a program with, we were looking at this really hard because most everybody at the UK column has some understanding and background of economic systems, enough to know that when you start printing up $6 trillion and stick that on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, and start buying up, government starts buying up equities, and then Trump starts saying General Motors needs to manufacture ventilators, and NASA needs to make, and you have a glut of ventilators, and people are building hospitals trying to emulate the Chinese. That this is the road to ruin in terms of democracy, because in a democracy you can't have a blank check. There must be accountability for the power of the purse. That's the most important thing, and saving lives and everything like that goes after that, because we're told that there's limited resources with the state, and this is why we pay taxes. This is why everybody plays by the rules, because there's finite amount of resources. There's not a magic money tree. And then all of a sudden this happens, and we find out actually there is a magic money tree, and the Fed will stick, $6 trillion on its books and bail out everybody, mostly at the top, and so we couldn't fix the Flint, Michigan water problem because there wasn't enough money to do that.
Right.
And that cost lives. So why is it different now? And I think as it unfolds, as this advances, and you start seeing this call for an international immunity passport regime, contact tracing, a la what they're doing in China right now, and a massive social control grid with huge implications in terms of personal freedom and personal liberties, even more than we've even had already. Then you have to really step back. Someone has to step back and look at this and saying, why are we doing this? And anyway, I'll stop there, and we can.
Right. Well, no, that's all to the good, because those are exactly the questions I started asking early on, even while I was saying, okay, I'm going to remain neutral on this, right? But I am going to point out, by the way, that they have motive, means, and opportunity to create a global superstructure here and a global police state. Right? From my perspective, the narrative is, very simple, that they failed to create an EU superstate that they could then use that as a means by which to export that superstructure through EU legislative demands. Like, if you want to trade with the EU, you got to play by our rules. It's the California model here in the United States. California passes some dumb law, and because California is the most powerful state in the union, everybody else has to eventually comport to California's rules in order to be able to sell to California. And it just and the same thing, they were running the same model with the European Union on global trade and global and global internet access and everything else. Like, to give you a perfect example, like Microsoft has implemented EU safety rules on links within emails, right? I can't even tell what the link is in an email because it goes through some EU safety link first, and I could still wind up going to a bad link because I can't actually mouse over the thing and see the actual link. All I see is some stupid EU thing. I'm like, that's Matt. Now imagine that writ large, and why they hate Donald Trump. And this is not necessarily for or against Donald Trump here, but why they hate Donald Trump is because Trump realizes immediately, got rid of the TPP and the TTIP, which were both meant to be transnational superstructures that would circumvent, that would exist on top of as an overlayer over national government, the same way that the EU exists over national governments in Europe. And that's failed because Trump got rid of those because the United States refused to play ball. For once, California said, hey, no, we're not going to make things worse. Now, so what's the next stage here? Well, we can try it with the medical complex. We can try and create a medical superstructure of regulatory framework that would create an Orwellian superstate modeled on the Chinese what's the word I'm looking for? Social system that they have, the social credit system.
Social credit
system.
Yes.
Thank you. And you can see it happening, and this, and you can see the same people that are behind this. You can see it all happening, and for us to not even bring that up and say, hey, is this possible as to what's actually going on here? And then to be lambasted as rank conspiracy theorists. No, this is the basics of what investigative journalism is. Because at this moment in time, okay, they've proven themselves in the past to be unbelievably horrible people. And at every time we said, oh, by the way, this is what they're doing. Oh, that's a horrible conspiracy. You live in Alex Jonesville, yada, yada, yada. It turns out we turned out to be right. So why should anybody give them cachet? But because they hit the basic fundamental fear of disease nobody understood in a culture that's been prepped for unbelievable levels of doom porn. It's already ready for it. If you look at our culture for the last 15 years, why are zombie movies so popular? Why is The Walking Dead so popular? Why is things like The Handmaid's Tale and all these other dystopian nightmare scenarios? Artists get there first. They understand that there's a fundamental anxiety that exists because the system that they've created isn't working. It's failing. Okay. And we had an incipient financial crisis to begin with that was already like targeted for the month of March. Like it was going to happen anyway. When the repo market seized up in September, we had about a 4 to 6, maybe 7 month period, grace period when the Fed stimulus came in to, allay the market's worst fears. That has about a 6-month halo effect, right? So this was going to happen anyway. But all we did now was take that, lop COVID-19 on top of it, which was now the catalyst to make it even worse in order to crash civilization so that these people would then have to they could then usher in the worst kind of social control system. This is like straight out of the movie for V for Vendetta. Like it's exactly the same scenario, right?
Yes, it is.
And it's unbelievably scary. And the difference here is that they're trying it with something that turned out to be not any better than the flu. And so any more deadly than the flu, honestly, because these are the numbers we now have. And so while I respect the fact that there are people going to be saying, look, this is Monday morning quarterbacking, not really, because what I led off with was the argument that this is Anthony Fauci is supposed to be the leading immunologist in the world, right? Him and the WHO and all these people were supposed to know this stuff. And as you brought up very cogently, we've never quarantined the healthy before. You always quarantine the sick. Why are we quarantining the healthy when the whole purpose of with the way our immune system functions is to interact with the world and each other? And it's fundamentally insane to have done this unless it was the confluence of their ineptitude in building a healthcare system that was capable of dealing with 2 flus at the same time. Because that's basically what we're looking at here. We're looking at 2 flu epidemics concurrently. And that was going to be enough to overwhelm a healthcare system that consumes 20 to 25% of our GDP here in the United States. Are you kidding me? I mean, hey, can we stop and ask that freaking question?
Yeah.
Because that's where we are. And that's the question people need to start asking themselves about this in the first place. And as this goes on, and as we reach these numbers, and we watch the Dr. Erickson video from and that's now 4.5 million views, just cogently making these arguments and saying, how can Anthony Fauci make these arguments unless, of course, he is compromised, unless, of course, he is just an inept politico and doesn't know anything and hasn't seen a patient in 20 years and all the rest of it, unless he's actually the mouthpiece for some very evil people. And Even if that's not the case, even if we give him the most generous, he's just inept and he should have his medical license revoked because, well, do no harm. And he just harmed hundreds of millions of people around the world. We've got market dislocations we have never seen before. Even in the worst of the Depression of 1929, does not compare. This is 10 times worse than this. It's 10 times worse than this.
Yeah, I've been in war zones and the economy didn't shut down.
Exactly.
It's functioning economy and it rolls on. Even countries under sanctions like Iran and Syria
and Lebanon.
In Lebanon, and I've been in these countries and seen how they function. They hobble along and everything doesn't shut down. There's some interruptions, of course. It's not like a full shutdown. And this was like a post 9/11 situation that was really scaled up, where you have this suspension of the belief that government is inept and incompetent, and all of a sudden, and this is how we felt about George Bush Jr. Before 9/11, and then as soon as 9/11 happened, everybody said, well, we have to trust the president, because the public at that point gets into a fight or flight mode.
Yep.
And the brain migrates from between the ears down into the gut.
Yep.
And when it does that, all rational thought and all these other things get sidelined, and you're in fight or flight. Politicians also get in that mode as well, even more so, because they're also looking at not being in power and employed, potentially, if they fumble it. But who drives the fight or flight at the end of the day? Who drives the fight or flight is the media.
Yep.
The media drives fight or flight, and the media does that hysterically. They do it for intentionally. They do it for profit, and they also inject politics into this. And I've said this before on another show, and I'll say it again. This pandemic and the reaction to it, which I believe is largely media driven. In the UK, the government came out with Boris Johnson, the science advisors, flanked on each side, gave a presentation in the middle of March that was basically what Sweden's policy is. And then after the media then sieged Johnson and Downing Street, saying that you can't say herd immunity, that's treating us like cattle. It was a vicious, politically correct reaction, mostly from progressives on the left. I'm not picking on them. I'm just telling you this is what it is. Yeah. And because he used the word herd immunity, that discredited that policy. And that then this ripple effect started where they just steamrolled him, that he came back 4 days later in front of the country and announced a lockdown effective the next day.
Yep.
So think about how many lives that this could potentially cost, not only the deaths that we're seeing in hospitals and care homes right now, which there are people now making a strong argument that lockdown policy is also accelerating COVID deaths, as well as other collateral damage. And the collateral damage will, as Dr. Erickson from Kern County said the other day, that will last a lifetime, not just this season. This was largely driven by a media that was obsessed partly with politically correct rhetoric, and this sort of the reaction that they then attacked politicians, or that were not taking this threat seriously. And so you have to ask yourself, why is that? Why would they be reacting like that? Because they've been glued to news reports from the media and from social media of what was happening in China in January, of people jumping off. There's fake news of people jumping off balconies, throwing their puppies and cats out, 10-story apartment buildings in Wuhan because they couldn't afford to feed them anymore, blah, blah, blah. Right. All emotive stuff. So this was priming the Western public. And so this is kind of a level of trauma-based mind control and conditioning that you saw after 9/11, and that allowed the public to really acquiesce and voluntarily accept any suspension of rights, democracy, or civil liberties. I mean, there's a great article by a UK journalist from the Telegraph recently that was saying that the thing that the ministers were surprised at, that he spoke to, was that the public, there was no pushback. They were preparing for pushback from the public after the announcement of the lockdown, but to their surprise, everybody just walked into their apartments and locked their doors voluntarily. They didn't expect it to people to comply and to be that sort of enthusiastic to play along with the policy. And so that kind of threw them off temporarily. They didn't quite know what to do. And then the reality begins to set in. And so there's a couple of important things that have come out of this. One of them, where I'm continuing on what you were saying, Tom, is the cashless society has been advanced really. I mean, if the ball was on the 50-yard line before, it's now on the 5-yard line.
Yep. Right
now. And part of this was putting out the meme and the lie. I'm going to call it a lie that cash was facilitating the spread of the coronavirus. Okay, and so all of the shops have these signs saying not accepting cash for your health and safety reasons in the UK. Oh. And everyone doing that enthusiastically because they believe that, and they think, well, they have to do everything they can to mitigate the spread of this disease. And then from there, it just goes crazy. Yep. I mean, everyone's got cash in their wallet. So the hysteria just accelerates at that point. But that's a really important agenda item because
yes, it is.
You don't have anonymity with your purchases. And most people wouldn't mind. They say, oh, why would you need to have anonymity on purchases if you're a good citizen? Well, we found out, didn't we, during this crisis when the police announced, one of the police forces announced in the UK that they'll be checking people shopping if they stop and search them on the street to see if they've only been out to get essential items only. If they find any non-essential items and they can't justify that trip to the market, then therefore they're breaking guidelines, not laws, but guidelines, which are going to be interpreted by the police forces. So you get the worst aspects. This is what Albert Camus, in his book, The Plague, the novel, the famous novel, The Plague, but also William McNeill in Plagues and People. And this is what those authors said, is that if there's any characteristics of society that existed before the pestilence, then those will be amplified during and after the plague or the pestilence. So if you have an authoritarian society, during peacetime, that's mitigated by democratic impulses and, other influences. But when they batten down the hatches during the crisis, that authoritarianism gets amplified. So the mirror that's held up to society, it just expands everything. If you have a corrupt civil service that's bloated, it's going to become more bloated.
Yep.
It's going to become more corrupt. If it's wasteful before, it's going to become more wasteful by orders of magnitude. So what do we see in the non-lockdown states that are running a fairly lean operation like Sweden, that their best qualities were amplified by their reaction to the policy? They have a strong social contract where you're actually their constitution puts a lot of onus on the citizen to take responsibility, and so therefore there's a level of trust between the government and the citizens that the government's not going to be abusing the population. And in the U.S. with the federal government, and in the UK and in Europe, it's totally different. You have Napoleonic law in France where everybody is guilty until proven innocent. They absolutely abuse their population in France. In the UK, they went full authoritarian on the population with a soft touch at times, but it was a pretty brutal U-turn that the UK government took after being attacked. In the US, you can see the federal government trying to impose a one-size-fits-all solution on everything, with delegating some power to states and governors, and then governors becoming petty dictators within their states.
Yep.
And then also the financial policy is just the quantitative easing, this Keynesian economics on steroids now. All the worst, I mean, if there was QE before, then that was bad, and zero interest rates. It's just gotten 10 times worse because of this crisis. You'd think that they'd want to roll back some of those major danger items during the crisis, so as to avoid massive damage when the crisis tails off. But they've done the opposite.
Yep.
So Camus was right, and so was McNeill. in their analysis of plagues.
No, you're correct, and one of the reasons I think for that is, and I said this I think on Twitter yesterday, and I said it in my live stream the other night. I said you got to remember that the easiest way to find someone's inner authoritarian or inner tyrant is to stoke their existential fear. The thing that they care about or are most worried about, and I've done this with progressives, I've done this with conservatives. Being a hardcore anarcho-libertarian, I do my best to take full responsibility for my life at a philosophical level. And whenever I get into a really hard argument with somebody about anything, it doesn't matter if it's the roads or it's this or whatever, when you hit somebody's existential threat, their pet peeve, most people are single issue voters, right? To put it in those terms. When you hit that thing, that thing that triggers their hardcore emotional response, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be that they were abused by their father when they were a kid, or that. It doesn't matter what it is. When you hit that, you will uncover their inner tyrant every time. They will justify any amount of curtailing your liberty to make them safe. And so all these people running around saying, flatten the curve, and oh my God, it all has to do with them trying to control your behavior because they're scared.
Yes, exactly.
Okay? It's just their projection of their fear. And the government and the media use this because they're just freaking anxiety pimps. Okay? They use it for their own power. They use it for their money. They use it for all the things you just talked about. But at the same time, they've overreached here because now they're going for a full authoritarian lockdown. No surprise that they're going for full authoritarian lockdown. Of course they are. These people are the ultimate tyrants. They want us to willingly accept the change because they understand that they can't just make it happen. They have to make it be our idea. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was proving that he doesn't exist, right? So, these lessons are all staring us right in the face. And I always make reference to movies and important stories because these are the things that are supposed to be teaching us the lessons of what not to do when these things occur, when these moments in time occur. And guess what? We're doing exactly what we shouldn't be doing. So, but what I'm noticing here is that it's beginning they've overreached, as I said earlier. And I really do think that that the worm is going to turn against this policy very, very quickly as people realize you've destroyed my life for no reason whatsoever. You've destroyed my neighbor's life for no reason whatsoever. You've now set people against each other, turning your neighborhood into a bunch of snitches. Right? No, seriously. I mean, why did the Karen meme come back so hard so quickly? Because no one wants to be told by their neighbor that they can't go outside and walk their freaking dog, or they can't have their kids play in the front yard. We're on lockdown. We're supposed, and worse than that, Patrick, you lock people away and and they've weaponized our humanity. They've weaponized the very social structure of human beings at both a physical and psychological level. As Dr. Erickson pointed out, we have to mix with the world and all the viruses and bacteria around so that our immune systems can continually attenuate to what's out there in reality, because the world is ever changing against us, because the universe is hostile to our existence, right? So now where are we? And then so we've taken that, and when you lock people away, they become insane.
Yeah.
You're destroying everything about civilization here. And the final, one last point, because this is the very important point. I'm an economist and a philosopher. As an economist, I use the word division. I use the phrase division of labor. When the division of labor is expanding, civilization is expanding. The demand for money expands because we need more money to filter, to make more subtle comparisons between value in a weird and an ever expanding society. We don't have that today, right? We have a contracting division of labor. That was going to happen regardless of COVID-19 and the lockdown. Now we've radically contracted the division of labor. That means that civilization itself has to contract. That means people's behavior has to contract. That means people's time preferences become shorter. They think only about today and tomorrow. They're not thinking about a year from now. They're not making plans for 5 years from now. They're making plans for tomorrow and next week. Okay? And that means that when they're in that fight or flight mode, when they're in that mode, They see everybody around them as an enemy. And we have to realize who the real enemy is here. Because right now, the very people that should be furloughed, not just furloughed, but fired from their jobs, the areas of our economy that we need to start looking at as luxuries, because they are the expansion of, they are the result of the expansion of civilization, that we've been able to suffer their inefficiency and their corruption and everything else, are the very people who are being empowered right now, i.e. the governments. Right.
Yeah, the whole concept of flattening the curve. This is a cheap, vapid soundbite that was dreamt up by some PR agency or some quisling somewhere in the communications annals of government. I mean, it is just the worst, most patronizing term you can possibly imagine. They're not flattening the curve. They're flattening the society. They're flattening the working class. They're flattening the middle class. What else are they flattening? They're flattening trust between the people and each other. Government. There's people. Maybe the most insidious part of this lockdown policy, and also just the general hypochondria culture. Is that, and I know this is a hard topic for some people, but like at some point you've got to face reality that everybody, unfortunately, one day is going to die, but a lot of people think they're immortal now in this sort of hyper narcissistic age of social media and self-preening. You're
right. It's now more. It's not going to. I like to use the term moral preening. It's even worse.
Virtue signaling becomes the religion, the most revered religion of today's society is virtue signaling. Absolutely. And it's dogmatic and it's meaningless. It's
pathetic.
But they're not flattening the curve. They're extending the life of the virus for starters. That's just standard epidemiology, undergraduate level. And again, that's been thrown out the window and discarded. So it's the battle between natural herd immunity versus synthetic corporate herd immunity. And synthetic corporate herd immunity is where the solutions are going to be provided by big government, by pharmaceutical transnational corporations, and by the likes of the foundation-funded moguls and philanthropists, so-called philanthropists like Bill Gates. So
and
they provide.
And the rest of them.
Yeah, they're into synthetic immunity, and that's a dependency immunity. So you're dependent on the state. You're dependent on pharma, and you're dependent on Bill Gates to fund it. So that's if you value liberty, freedom, sovereignty, national sovereignty, personal health sovereignty, then you should, in theory, reject synthetic immunity, and you should go with traditional human immunity, because this is why we're here. This is how we got here to this year in history since the beginning of time, is that our body and our immune system has developed this, and with each other. This is what families do. This is what communities do. This is this is why it was stupid to close the schools for the children. This is why they didn't do that in Sweden, in other countries. So that's one fundamental paradigm that people need to understand. And by the way, there's a lot of good medical metaphors that you can apply to this situation to help people understand it. One of them is that they have, government's reaction is an autoimmune reaction, very similar to the autoimmune reaction that you would get if your body detected a coronavirus in the tissues of your throat or lungs. It incites a cytokine storm that floods your lungs with fluid and mucus and things to try to kill the virus. That's what kills you, is pneumonia. It's not the coronavirus that kills you. It's the autoimmune reaction to the presence of your body scans and picks up and detects the RNA of the coronavirus. So government has done the exact same thing. Government has seen a threat coming and said, "Oh my gosh, and they've overreacted. They have destroyed. They've invoked a scorched earth policy to destroy something. So they thought The government and the media have told us that there's a train coming, and we believed it was a train when in reality it was a moped.
Or a toy train.
Or we could have stepped on the side and really let it drive past us.
Exactly.
But the screaming liberals, I'm not picking on liberals, and I don't self-identify with conservative or liberal. I'm just saying I see them in the media and on social media.
Sure.
And these people, the CNNs of the world, the MSNBCs, they're the worst of the bunch, and they were really driving the hysteria from the beginning. And so we adopted. And then you have the neoconservatives and the warhawks, who are even more ridiculous.
Yes.
The Lindsey Grahams of the world, the Tom Cottons of the world. Everybody, Donald Trump was in on the act as well, the Chinese virus. Mm-hmm. Even Tucker Carlson said the Wuhan virus. He made a point to say that on his program the other night. And so they're basically baiting China into some kind of a geopolitical conflict over this, okay? Mm-hmm. And at the same time they're doing that, and they're decrying China and they're screaming China. So the left is screaming pandemic, okay, lock us down. You need to begging for a lockdown and don't want to let the lockdown up. The right is screaming for a war, or Josh Hawley in Missouri wanting to sue China for damages. Okay, right. So ridiculous. Those who want to sue China for a decision they made because they were stupid enough to emulate China's lockdown policy. And now they want to sue China for economic damages? Exactly. You got to be kidding me. You must be really stupid. But this is what the West did. Why? Because we have increasingly fascist and authoritarian tendencies with big government. And they look at China with such glee. And they say, wow, if only we could get away with what China does. Yep. Or I've heard these conversations, too, with conservatives and also liberals as well, Democrats. They're so impressed with the way China handles and manages its society, this command and control single party state. Well, that's really what's being developed in the West in terms of politics. And so we copied their lockdown. We love their contact tracing system, their mass testing. Let me tell you, mass testing is not something that you want to get into full time, because if you start mass testing everybody for COVID-19, this crisis will never end. The worldometer and the stats meters that everybody is glued to right now will never stop ticking over. There will be a constant 24/7, 365-day-a-year crisis, never going to end. And they'll have this Chinese mobile app contact tracing, and who knows what other kind of personal semiconductor in terms of tracing. But if you come in with 6 feet of anybody in China that tests positive, you get assigned a color and you have to immediately go into quarantine. Drop what you're doing. If you're going to go to work, get married, travel, you're with the kids, doesn't matter, quarantine.
It's insane.
That's the Chinese system.
That's insane. It's fundamentally insane. And I'll tell you something, and this is something that they're to remind you of at a political level. Don't ever discount the fact that at the end of the day, this is just the same political ideology writ large that's existent now for over 100 years here in the United States. It's called progressivism, which, by the way, is really just progressives are just proto-cultural Marxists. They just started self-identifying as cultural Marxists after friggin' Derrida and Sartre and all those French jackasses from the 70s. But the reason, and it comes down to this, it's the prevention principle, right? If you ever really listen to an environmentalist who's an ideologue, you ever listen to anybody who's a truly dyed-in-the-wool progressive. And by the way, at a certain level, conservatives are not immune to this, which is first do no harm. That they fundamentally believe that whatever was existent yesterday is a fundamental good, and any change away from that is a fundamental bad. Okay, and that there's no, so if you really stop thinking, they always want to prevent the worst of things, and if you can't guarantee for them that you can prevent X from happening, then we need to not ever do anything like X. So if I can't, as a libertarian, I can't make the argument to them that I can't prevent every instance of some guy using his access on a private road from giving you access to the public roads. That means we have to have public roads everywhere. That's the prevention principle. Well, it's the same thing that's been applied here to the lockdown, to COVID-19. we're going to prove to you, if you can't prove to me that locking people down is the wrong response, then we're going to lock everybody down because we're going to err on the side of caution. We're going to err on the side of preventing a problem. Well, that's not the way the world works. They are a risk-averse, screaming me babies. They really are, and they can't literally function in the risk of the world because they still have not fully identified and integrated into themselves the fact that they're going to die. You mentioned this earlier, and I fundamentally believe this. That it's an infantile response or a childish response to an existential threat that they cannot understand, and everything has become an existential threat to them because they've gotten positive feedback from the government and from the media and everybody else for acting this way. If you look at, I read an article last week called "We've Become Karen Nation." If you really stop to think about what the meme of Karen is about, Karen complains to her waiter, and the manager gives her a free plate of fries or a free burger or writes her meal off. She gets a free month of cable, right? Because she wants to speak to the manager. Well, I got news for you. She's now empowered. She's getting a positive dopamine hit to go do it again. Yeah. And why have we become such friggin' anxiety-ridden noradrenaline junkies?
Well, do you remember? You're old enough to remember John Travolta, The Boy in the Bubble?
Yep, I am.
Okay,
mm-hmm.
so this is what we have now. We have a whole generation that's yes. the boy or the girl in the bubble, right. And if you look at the way that
I think that's actually I want to say is I think that's what the media and the government want us to believe we should be, right? And if you the counter to that is then explain why Jordan Peterson is so popular, because he's telling an entire generation of men the exact opposite, and they're all going, yes, I get it.
Yes.
Okay. So, but go ahead.
Yeah. We'll get on to Jordan Peterson in a minute, but so parents, helicopter moms and dads. Yes. Okay. You know, the way that not allowing kids to, you talk to the way kids are being raised now, and you're old enough to see a whole generation go through this kind of helicopter parent generation where the kids don't have any real freedoms. Now they're being tracked with family apps and things like that on their phone. They can't socialize. They can't go and basically go on an adventure in the woods and come back, 16 hours later with, a broken toe and,
right.
The things that we were allowed to do that I didn't understand wouldn't be available for the subsequent generations, right. But we were allowed to basically go wild as kids.
I nearly died just climbing the friggin' mountain that I was told the story recently. As a 14-year-old, my development that I grew up in upstate New York was sort of like literally cut out of the side of a small mountain, right? And and the top level access road was below the top peak of the mountain. So we used to climb up, and it was mostly shale. We used to climb up onto that thing, and we just like climb around and pop into the cross the fence into West Point's area where they would run their war games and go visit, just run around in the woods, right? Well, that place was dangerous. It was covered with moss. There was a layer of moss over shale. I freaking went up there one morning and very arrogantly was walking in some of the most dangerous areas and slipped and started to fall. And nearly freaking fell 15 feet to a bunch of broken ribs and possibly, punctured a lung, because to a bed of shale underneath me. And I happened to grab the tree right there at the end. I was growing out of the shale. Otherwise, I'd have been in serious trouble. Let's just put it that way. And I'm like,
near-death experience as a kid. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's like one of the only things I remember from being that age. I was either 13 or 14 or whatever, other than, nearly burning down the woods, because we were out there, melting matchbox cars with gasoline, because we didn't have anything else to do during the summer. This is just stuff that we did. And we had to learn on our own just how dangerous the world could be. And I don't know. My mom was horrified, but what are you going to do about it? At the end of the day, my dad kind of looked at me and went, dumbass, and then we moved on.
Yeah, we spent more time outdoors. We spent more time with our friends outdoors doing things, and we didn't have tablets and smartphones, and we spent a lot less time in front of the television. Mm-hmm. And then as days and years and TV time increased, DVDs for kids, where babysitting was put in a Disney DVD and leave the kids there for 3 hours while you sit on the phone with your friends, and all these different other, or mom goes out to aerobics and Pilates or whatever. Now with the tablets and the phones, it's even worse.
Yep.
So this is the helicopter state, and the helicopter state is perfectly suited for the helicopter children who were raised by helicopter moms and dads. And so the nanny state has become more of a commando nanny state now. And that's truly frightening. So they're making moves and decisions that are not thought out at all, completely overreacting, going full Wuhan, as Steve Bannon himself said. He said, we need to go full Wuhan on his show, The War Room. That's Trump's brain, or half of his brain. And so he even said that. So that's the big conservative Steve Bannon, the anti-China guy, sitting there drooling over the Chinese, the way the Chinese handled the COVID-19 crisis. So everything that China did was not appropriate to copy. And you know what? China's neighbors didn't do what China did. Japan did not lock down. Taiwan did not lock down. South Korea did not lock down. And they're really on the doorstep of that crisis. The countries that were a little bit pedantic have actually had some not so great results. So the non-lockdown states, on average, have performed better in terms of deaths per million. And it's not to be cruel by using that stat only, but if it's all about saving lives, then surely the best metric is deaths per million, because we're told this is about saving lives. Right. And someone attacked me the other day. They said, it's not about saving lives, it's about saving the health services. Okay, fine. But let's just use that metric. Okay, so if you get a better or equal performance from not instituting a lockdown policy on average in general, and then you have the choice of getting equal or better results doing that, or instituting a shutdown of your economy, a shutdown of your society, really risking the relationship between citizens and government and the trust as well. Government's approval ratings are not going to go up after this, by the way. They're going to go down, as are the mainstream media's approval ratings. They're going to go really, really down. If you have that choice, it shouldn't be, in theory, a difficult decision. Do you commit economic suicide and destroy and abuse your population to get X result, or can you get X result without doing that? And believe you me, this is actually a hard question for some people right now to answer, because they're so invested in this victim lockdown situation. And for the government, this is once you cross the red line in terms of that level of an authoritarian decision, and once the public are that compliant, the government is in a paradox, because once you step over the line then to the totalitarian side, you can't step back, because if you step back, you will then potentially reap a massive public backlash when people find out that the threat was not as high as you had sold it to the public. So the media and government will suffer that backlash. So therefore, what does totalitarian states normally do? They double down after stepping over that red line. They don't step back unless they're humble, and they'll admit, oh, sorry, we screwed up, but we're going to change the policy now because we miscalculated, but we're going to make it right and just take the hit. No, governments today, in the social media publicity-driven society that we've erected, they will not accept a short-term hit in their credibility and ever admit they ever made a mistake. Absolutely. Or all resign en masse. This is the time when everyone in government should resign en masse. There was no debate over emergency legislation. Everybody just fell into line with it. Nobody stood up and opposed it, not in any of these countries. And so at that point, I think government has shown that itself is not fit for purpose. No, so it's not government's not fit for purpose as such. Yes, structurally it's not fit for purpose. It's bloated. It's ineffective. It can't even make any logical or intelligent decisions. But the people in government are no longer fit for purpose.
Yeah, no, they aren't.
And so there needs to be a sea change in thinking. And so if anything good comes out of this crisis, it's shown the absolute ineptness and negligence of this way of leading countries.
I agree.
And,
no.
Yeah. So anyway,
I know. I fully agree with you, and I'm at that point as well. The anger that's coming here, they will never admit that they're wrong. You can see it. So from the moment that the words hydroxychloroquine left Trump's mouth, it was very obvious that they had a larger agenda here, and that they then kept running this playbook, and they realized at that moment that we have a cure for this, for the people who are acute, who are showing symptoms, and the data is going to start showing that the numbers don't justify the procedure. So now we've got Bill Gates literally saying his foundation is abandoning other initiatives that focus 100% on coronavirus. I'm looking at a headline from Zero Hedge from this morning. He's now calling this pandemic number 1 because guess what? Pandemic number 2 will be around the corner. If it's a minor variation on CV19, it'll be CV20 or CV21 because again, the goal here is to keep us in a constant state of anxiety where we're not making rational choices. We're not reacting with our forebrains. We're reacting with fear in our hindbrains. And moreover, it's even worse because we become such a divided society, certainly here in the United States, where everybody who hates Donald Trump wants to discredit everything he says and does. And everybody who likes Donald Trump wants to credit everything he says and does. And that's the whole purpose of Twitter. That's the whole purpose of social media at this point, is to continue to have us fighting amongst ourselves while they take over the world. And it's just terrible. And they're going to continue this. Like Fauci refuses to back up, to back down here, saying we may have to be dealing with this for the next 18 months. And moreover, and at the same time, the government officials who are rational, who realized that I think Trump realized very early on that he'd been sold a pig in a poke. And then he needed to start backing away from this as quickly as possible and somehow extricate himself from this. You get to see it from the way he kept putting stuff out there that he wasn't supposed to, right? And all those memes of Fauci, doing the facepalm thing and Bierce going, oh my God, how could he say that? Trump's not an idiot. He knows exactly what's going on. I'm not saying I'm not saying he's handled this well or not handled this well. I think he's handled it as well as he could have, given the information he's been given. And eventually he always listens to his advisors and then realizes that his advisors told him something bad. And now he has to extricate himself from a terrible policy, which is why he put out the guidelines when he did. Literally to the day that Scott Adams was telling him if he didn't put out a friggin' national plan of opening back up the economy, Scott was like, I'm going to make my own. Like we saw functional anarchy coming from Mr. Milquetoast himself, Scott Adams, right? So I look at this and I'm like, it's very obvious that Trump is trying to let this open. So I think there's a lot of politicians who realize that they've jumped the shark here. They've made a terrible mistake, and they need now to back away in such a way that they save face. So we're going to keep the lockdown orders open, on file for another couple of extra weeks to allay as compromise. So that's what politicians always do. They're trying to save face here. A lot of them are. I don't know that a guy like DeSantis here in my state of Florida is going to do that. I think he's going to let the lockdown order expire on April 30th, and we're all going to get to go back to work. I haven't gone back to work. I work from home, but it'll at least stop the process of everybody going, oh, what do we do? No, you go back to work. Like, grow up, grow a pair. That's it. Sorry, it's time to go back to work. Okay. And people are ready for it, and they want to open their businesses back up. I think that'll happen here in Florida, and in New York, people like Cuomo are going to pay a very terrible price, and they have to figure out a way to back away slowly and still save face. And some of them will apologize, and some of them will say, well, we did make a mistake.
They're going to have to.
They have to. If they don't, because I've been saying for months, Patrick, I don't know if you've heard this or not. I've been saying for months, I'm along guillotines here. I'm along guillotines. I'm along pitchforks. I'm along rope makers. Right. Those are the only, and gold, obviously, but for different reasons. And I mean that sincerely, that the amount of anger that's incipient right now because of what they've done. And when people truly understand just how much they've been sold a fake pandemic.
Yeah.
They're going to get.
I knew that was coming.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. And
I knew it was coming.
And when I saw them like oversell this, and I saw them So when I saw them try to downplay hydroxychloroquine, I knew that they were in trouble. And then it's a good, and in some ways it's a good thing. And I think it is one of the things that needs to happen. And I'm going to tell you something else that's coming. And that is that you're going to see we have destroyed the functional economy. As I go back to my original point from the beginning, that the division of labor equals civilization. And we have now destroyed the division of labor. We have complete and utter dislocations in the oil markets, the food chain, in every aspect of our society. That's everything that's downstream of energy, which would be the entire economy. Okay. You've done this. You've done the kind of damage that's been done. I got news for you. The reverberatory effects of that throughout the economy for the next 6 months to a year at a minimum are enormous. You do realize that the life cycle for every slaughtered heifer that was slaughtered because the farmer couldn't feed her, who was a productive heifer, it's going to take 5 years to replace her. You do realize that, right? Now, pigs and chickens will take a lot less time. I also farm. Like, I've also done hobby farming. I own goats, the whole nine. Gold, goats, and guns is not just a catchy phrase. It's an ethos and it's a lifestyle. So, the beef industry is going to go through a sincere contraction here in the United States because we've done tremendous damage to the beef markets. And, thankfully pigs recover much faster and chickens recover much faster, and that's fine. But, I was just scrolling through Zero Hedge while you were speaking earlier, and then there's the head of Tyson Foods saying, oh, by the way, we have destroyed the meat supply chain here in the United States. And we're going to see the price of grains around the world rise because countries are not exporting, because they need the rice domestically. Their production is down. All of this stuff is happening. The Russians are going to hit their export quota at the end of this month. And then for Q2, that means they're not going to export any wheat for May and June. How is that going to do with wheat prices around the world? I mean, it's everywhere. And right now, people are still getting fed. There's still enough food. There's still enough. The electricity's still working, yada, yada, yada. The internet's still on. Netflix is still working, yada, yada. Okay, fine. What happens when that starts to fail at a real level, when people are out of work and the price of meat triples?
Well, people who work in government, they're not going to be very concerned because they'll be, the last to be put on the street in terms of being laid off.
Yep.
People who work for big corporations, they'll remain employed. People work in the financial sector, they're employed because they're getting constant stream of bailouts exactly from the federal government. People who work in media organizations who are big corporate, they might experience some pain, and you might see some whistleblowers and dissenters who be generated from that group of journalists. You're already seeing it now. They're kicking and screaming. People in publications fighting with editors. I can already see it now. This is very encouraging.
Yes,
but people who work for state-owned media, like the BBC and other state-owned broadcasters, they'll stay employed, so they'll maintain a moderate or conservative position on this and not rock the boat too much generally, because they want to keep their jobs. Yep. So basically, anybody who's in employment with the government or the state, they're not going to be raising the alarm or caring too much about what's going on, and so that's not necessarily good when the government is really massive, like in the United States.
Right.
So it's a huge group of people that are just basically not going to oppose anything that the government's doing. We saw the same thing with the war on terror and the national security state, the same problem.
Yep.
That was allowed to escalate for that reason. But back to the chloroquine point that you made, yeah, of course, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, which Anthony Fauci represents in his official capacity with the U.S. government, he's really a facilitator for the pharmaceutical and the chemical industrial complex too, because that goes hand in hand with the pharmaceutical industrial complex.
Yes, it does.
And also big agra as well, because they're also hand in hand with big pharma.
Yep.
So that's who Fauci represents. And of course, anything that costs 10 cents a tablet that's open source, not licensed, that's not going to do. Instead, they're promoting $100 or $1,000 a tablet drugs to do this more or less the same thing. So So that's one thing. The other thing is that's about treating people. That's about getting people better. And our medical system is really about processing people and sticking them on ventilators, for instance, which is one of the things that I was very disappointed. But Trump is limited in his capacity mentally sometimes. That he's a business guy, so he likes gadgets and latching on to hardware. He loves military hardware and things like that. So he latched on to ventilators. The media did as well. So that Trump was like, oh, here's something that at least the media will sort of run with me on, which is this idea that ventilators, all you need is hundreds of thousands of ventilators. And I started to have visions there of, Stalin's Soviet supply chain.
Yes.
That's just totally unsustainable. And now, of course, what do we have is warehouses full of expensive ventilators that will never get used. Okay. Yep. And so that's not how you run an economy. But of course, all those rules have been thrown out the window, as you said before, because it's an emergency. The taps are off on the Fed, and they're just printing like crazy. But this is the lockdown is a medieval lockdown. This is what they did in medieval times. So my argument, progressives and people on the left were arguing with me before in the previous week, saying that it's the right-wing reactionaries in America who want to lift the lockdown. They're the problem. I said no. I said the reactionaries are the ones who wanted to impose the lockdown because they're regressive. Those are the reactionaries. You want to impose a medieval experimental policy that's never been done before, where you quarantine healthy as well as the sick and collapse the economy. It's not even done in wartime, and that's reactionary. That's a medieval solution to a middle-aged solution to a 2020 situation in the 21st century. That's not going to end well. And so, but it's predicated, like you were saying before, on this kind of these progressive maxims that are so mainstreamed, like the responsibility to protect, the precautionary principle, and so it's. So they're obsessed with this idea, and they'll roll out this trope that all lives are precious. All lives are precious. Even people above the age of 80 with triple comorbidities and long-term chronic health conditions, etc. And even if we can extend their life for 6 months or a year, we need to do whatever we can, including shut down the economy.
How about you pay for it? Excuse me, I'm going to look right. Just stop you right there. That sounds great. You pay for it. No, that's what we're all supposed to. No, you pay for it. I don't want to. I'm sorry. At the end of the day, I'm not going to risk 50,000 kids getting beat by their drunk fathers or molested by their drunk uncles. I'm not going there. I'm sorry. There's a risk and there's a risk reward curve for everything in this world, and you have to come to terms with that. These are people who have not come to terms with their own mortality, and so therefore we have to extend that to everybody. And I heard it the other day when I was on Fault Lines. I mentioned, look, we locked down 104 million people under the age of 24, where there have been 24 COVID-related deaths in this country. 104 million people under the age of 24, all locked down, 24 deaths. And then, I'm listening to people yell at me, well, if you're over the age of 80, I guess you get to die. All right, fine. No, that's not what I said. I said, you've got 104 million people that could be out there creating herd immunity against this thing to help save some of those 80 million people, or those over 80 people.
But
that's the point.
They're obsessed with this idea that if you come into contact, you're within 6 feet of anybody that sneezes, that it's a death sentence. This is what they've been conditioned to believe. It's a plague, when in fact it's not. It's a cold virus.
Yes.
It might be a highly infectious cold virus, and yes, it might affect people who are vulnerable and in high-risk groups with immune-compromised people. And maybe there's more about this coronavirus that we don't yet know fully and fully understand yet. I understand all that. But it's not a death sentence, even if you're over 80. Only 23% of those people who are positive tested in over 75 or whatever, only 20-something percent of them require any hospitalization or serious medical care. So it's not even a death sentence for you if you're an elderly person. So in terms of the law,
but it's a death sentence for you if you have other acute medical problems that you can't get treated for now, because the hospitals aren't doing that work.
Yes, and that's happening.
Yeah, that's real.
Yeah, that's real. That's happening by cancer patients.
Yes.
I just spoke to a doctor in Northern Ireland. I mean, they've had like, I don't know how many deaths, but maybe under 100. I'm not sure in the whole country. And they said that they had 40 appointments scheduled for colonoscopies. It's a very important procedure in terms of advanced screening on bowel cancer and things like that. So, and only 4 people showed up.
Wow.
So this is hugely problematic.
Right.
There's a lot of people I know that have said that they don't want to go to the hospital, even if they need to. No, also there's people with pneumonia that if you get treatment for pneumonia early on and it gets identified either via CT scan or something like that, and then you get the right prescription of antibiotics, for instance, if it's a bacterial pneumonia, you're fine. But if you let it go to an acute stage because you're at home, because you've been told to stay at home and self-isolate, that's not good.
No, it's terrible.
You could die.
Right.
And that's what's happening in scores right now. So, and again, this is all based on the decision, the voluntary decision to lock down by governments. It wasn't, there is no alternative. This is what the screaming left are saying, and this is what the Stalinists are saying, is there is no alternative, that the state must act in grand fashion and do something to reassure the people about their ability to deal with the crisis. But the non-lockdown states didn't do that. They chose a common sense approach. So that's the control group. All the computer modelers like at Imperial College and the University of Washington, what they should be modeling now is the non-lockdown countries, because now you have real data. You can compare non-lockdown versus lockdown. In America, I almost got patriotic looking at these free 8 states, looking at Nebraska, Iowa, and Nebraska being my home state. I was particularly proud that they're a non-lockdown state. And then North, South Dakota, Utah, Arkansas.
Nobody lives in these states. They have a human density of what? 3 people per square mile?
Yeah, they're not that dense.
Right.
But they don't have to make any of these decisions about unwinding this situation because they didn't start making it. They didn't do it in the first place.
Exactly.
So the option of doing nothing is actually initially should always be on the table.
Always.
If you're faced with a war or a major decision of government or statecraft, the option to do nothing, at least in the short term, until you can calculate what is the best strategy, or to have contingencies as you go along to adapt your policy as you go along. But that's not what happened. Most people looked to China and they made the decision, or in America, they looked to New York and they made the decision that followed Governor Cuomo or Anthony Fauci. What he said, he scared the living daylights out of Americans by saying that 2.2 million people would die if these mitigation measures weren't put in place. That's a total lie. That was based on computer model projections. And by the way, those are the same computer models and same software and same methods that are used to project climate change.
Yep.
And I'm just throwing that out there because if we learn anything,
I don't have another hour and a half to do that one, but I'm happy. I'm with you on that. One thing I want to interject real quick. Just remember, whenever somebody's giving you one option, we either do this or else, they're lying to you. There's always more options. Whenever somebody's giving you an ultimatum, they're lying. When government's giving you an ultimatum, they're definitely lying. There's always other options. This is the only option that's acceptable to them. And again, we exist in a society where people who cannot, if they can't they can't see a solution that makes sense to them, then one does not exist. They don't have any trust that there are other people out there who will act, who can find that solution. Just because you can't find a solution to a problem doesn't mean one does not exist. And yet but this is the fallacy of the prevention principle or the precautionary principle. This is the fallacy of progressive social engineering and all the rest of it. It's the fundamental problem of cultural Marxism. But it's again another discussion for another day. These things all of these precepts, these basic concepts have to be utilized right now to blow holes in and destroy these narratives. Because if we don't, we're going to be dealing with the Walking Dead. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in that world. I got enough guns. I'm good. Don't come to outer Luongolia. Just saying.
I've never watched that program, and I don't actually want to watch it. I saw 28 Days Later, the British one, that was bad enough. But again, with the right thinking, conservative thinking, libertarian thinking, liberal, leftist, or cultural Marxist, as you described it, with these kind of the left has this shaping the world as I imagine it. Mm-hmm. And maybe when you veer more to the right or more into the libertarian zone, it's the world as it is. Yes. So in international relations, you have the school of realism, international relations, and then you have the liberal internationalist school, which is the most dominant school after World War II. But then the realist school came in because of the Cold War, because then it became binary. It's a power game between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the United States. But this idea of imagining international structures that are going to be harmonious, and this will be a kind of utopia where the pinnacle of that would be a world government. That was the theme of the Cambridge debate last week, which was hosted, a virtual debate where Peter Hitchens took place in that debate along with a number of other people. But the proposition from Cambridge University was a global government solution to the COVID-19 crisis. So that is a major, the leading intellectual institution, one of them in the West, and they led with the theme of global government. Of course. So I'm just throwing that out there because if you look at this international regime of contact tracing, immunity passports, restricting travel if you don't have a vaccine or if you might have, quote, high risk for COVID, that is, you will need a global government structure or people to opt into some kind of hard governance in order to administrate that and to basically roll that out. Okay. And that will include big data sharing across platforms internationally, facial recognition, all of the things that we see in China that have been formalized already and already operational, that would be rolled out globally. And let me tell you, that's not a pretty world to live in. No. For some people might like it. They might think it's great, and they might think it makes them feel safe. But the potential for abuse by states and the major corporations that are basically partnering with them is so great. And we already see examples of this already. There's no need to speculate how bad that could get because we're already experiencing it on different levels already. Mm-hmm. And we're already seeing what China's like and how they administrate this system. And people need to take a hard look at this and say, is that what I want for my future? Is that what I want for the kids and grandkids in the future? Do I want them to live in that level of obsessive social distancing, 24-hour track and tracing system on the back of this that has a case fatality rate that's in line with the seasonal flu?
Yeah, no, it's insane.
Yeah.
It's absolutely insane. And the fact that this is just a dry run for, I agree with Dr. Shiva about this. This is your beta rollout of global vaccination. Of that product. I agree with him completely about this, and I'm at that point where this needs to end. And the good news is that I think that if you really look at the way people are starting to say no to this, and to push back against it, the anger's coming, and when the anger comes, it's going to come quickly, and they're not going to know how to deal with it, and then it's going to be a question of who does and who doesn't have food and who's getting paid, and that's going to get ugly. And I can tell you that to me, the Hunger Games is no longer allegory; it's like the world that's on the horizon. That's what they're prepping us for. So, Patrick, this has been an unbelievable conversation. I've had a really good time. So if you want any final thoughts, I just want to kind of wrap up here because we're getting towards the particularly, long for one of these episodes.
Sure. Well, I just wanted, the last thing I'll say, just to leave it on a positive note. Mm-hmm. I've also seen sort of the embryonic signs of some people self-organizing locally.
Yes.
through this crisis, and that's really encouraging, and really people really paying attention to how things are working and functioning. I think that will also be a legacy of this,
Yes.
train wreck, basically.
Without a doubt. No, without a doubt. I think that if there was ever an argument, and again, this is a discussion for another day. If there was ever an argument about where I see the use case in the real world for Bitcoin and private cryptocurrencies, they just made it for us. You're going to go to a cashless society and you want to track us everywhere we go? Excuse me, dude. I'm just not listening anymore. And that's where local currencies come in. That's where we start to opt out when these systems break down to this point, because all the things that they've done here, and we didn't touch on this stuff at this level today, but all they've done is they've accelerated the collapse of their own systems. Okay. These systems are unsustainable. These government systems, these top-down law. I mean, I got news for you. China is in serious trouble politically. Okay. I believe that China will be where the world winds up in 20 years, where all the global capital is. I don't know that it's going to be under the Chinese Communist Party. Mm. Okay. I think something may have to change between now and then in order for global capital to actually want to go there, because I don't think they're going there at this point in time. But the collapse of this system of global patronage, of magic money tree and all of this stuff and oligarchic control is reaching its zenith. It's reaching its apotheosis. And to me, this lockdown is a classic example of them overreaching out of abject terror, because the populist wave against them, they weren't stamping it out. Brexit happened, dude. Italy is going to leave. Okay. I mean, the United States is going to not survive this in its current form. Yeah. California is going to leave. Florida's when the food supply breaks. I've been talking about this with friends of mine. When the food supply breaks down here in the United States, are you kidding me? Florida's self-sufficient. We're not slaughtering our cows down here, and we're not going to export our freaking food to people starving in Kentucky. I got news for you. We're just not going to do it. We're going to say no. And if they try to institute some kind of tariff of abomination to force us to do it, we'll be right back to 1860 again.
Yes, but the important difference between Europe and the United States is, the United States is it's a type of a federalized republic system. Okay, Europe as well, but you see, Europe, there's just strong cultural and historical and racial identities within each existing country. The Absolutely. EU has taken a total backseat on this crisis, and it's really empowered the nation states for good or bad. In terms of Hungary and Albania, it was a Corona coup, basically. Yeah. In Albania, a full-on coup with Edi Rama declaring martial law on March 9th. Mm-hmm. But Viktor Orban in Hungary, so it did amplify the authoritarian urges that were there, but also in the United States, it's different, because in the U.S., one of the saving graces of the United States is that there is some sovereignty within each state. So not every state dealt with it the same way. And when the founders created the United States, what they, intentionally or not, they created a type of internal competition system between states, whereby there's different state regulations, and the federal government had limited powers. And so it became a kind of a competitive thing to attract the best and the brightest or the best industry. And so you had to have policies that worked for people. And that's what we've seen with the crisis in America, is that some states panicked, other states didn't. Yes. And if you're sitting in Florida, Tom, or you're sitting in Georgia and you've been devastated, and you look next door in Arkansas and they're still going around in bars and cafes without, going crazy. Well,
I can give you an even better example of that. I live in Columbia County, equidistant between Lake City and Gainesville. Gainesville's on lockdown. Everybody in Lake City is just going about their normal business. I don't see any masks. I don't see anything. It's just, traffic's a little lighter, but for the most part, it's a rural city. And county by county, we have different we have different policies, and we have different infection rates, and we have different governments. We have a very laissez-faire kind of right-wing, basically libertarian government in Columbia County. We have out and out freaking Portland, Oregon style commies in Alachua County. Alachua County is going to be devastated. It's where the University of Florida is. Okay. It's going to be devastated, especially since the University of Florida itself is going to be devastated over time. So absolutely. And that patchwork, and those internal tensions are going to get amplified over time as people really begin to understand, why are we paying for all of this stuff? Like, the Columbia County government doesn't cost us anything. I mean, seriously, it doesn't cost us. I mean, I don't care about those people, right? There's like 5 people. I mean, the school board office isn't open on Mondays, for Christ's sake. They only work 4 days a week because you know what I mean? I mean, it's just like the building department and the codes enforcement office are all like one thing. It's not. There's not a bloated bureaucracy because we can't afford it because it's a poor county, right? Whereas in Alachua, it's everywhere, and the government's in every aspect of your life, and the tax level is 3 times higher than it is in the surrounding counties, and it's that stuff that's going to exacerbate tensions, and it's going to force people to make different decisions. And and we're just going to see a fundamental awakening of why the hell are we paying for all of this? Why are we paying our taxes? We pay our taxes for them to keep us in line. Oh, I got it now. I'm not doing that anymore. That's coming. And that's coming in spades. And I'm going to watch. And they're asking that question in Italy right now. Why aren't we paying the EU when the EU has gone out of their way to ensure that we all died? Like, I've said this before, like, I'm Italian on both sides, going back to the boat, second generation Italian. I got a little bit of Sicilian in me. If you think that the Italians are going to stand by and allow the Germans to kill the grandmothers and then take over all of the ports and everything else as payment for bailing out their banks, you don't know Italians. Like, they're not going to stand for that. And Giuseppe Conte better figure that out quick, or he's going to be strung up by his toenails and fed to dogs. Like, and
the big test is going to come with the state has a choice, because the state has to justify keeping people, quote, safe. So putting in a whole regime and a whole layer of new measures and departments and so forth. If the people reject that on the basis of this is an overblown crisis, pandemic, or threat, and the government mismanaged it, then they won't be able to go forward with that level of sort of, creating the security framework that the state needs in order to justify its own existence, basically.
Yeah.
And if it's whether the people accept that or reject that on a state level in the U.S. or on a national level or an EU level in Europe, that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch.
It is absolutely, and I think we'll leave it there. That's a great way to end the show. I think it's the right metaphor for everything that's happening at this moment in time. Patrick, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed every minute of it, and we must do this again sometime. So, but for now, let's leave it here, and we'll pick it up at a later date. So, if you want to, say something on the outro and let that go, and then we'll call it a day.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate the invite, Tom.
You take care. You have a great afternoon, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye-bye. That's it for this show. I hope you enjoyed it. It went a little longer than normal, but it was a good conversation. And, one of the things that's funny about this, and one of the things I've really enjoyed about doing this podcast, is that I've been able to use it as a means by which to meet people whose work I respect and get to know them personally. And that's been a great thing for me. I just enjoy it from that perspective, even if it doesn't generate a tremendous amount of traffic. It's just fun for me to do and open up the conversation with different people and get different perspectives and fill in my knowledge gaps on things. So I appreciate all that, and I certainly appreciate Patrick's generous time this morning. So as always, you can follow my work over at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. Places like Strategic Culture, moneyandmarkets.com, Zero Hedge, Lou Rockwell, and all the rest of it. And I urge you all to read those sites as well. They are all excellent, along with Patrick's site, 21wire.com. It's all good. The dissident media is needed and necessary for us to stay within contact with each other, even when we don't all agree with each other about all issues. I'll leave it there. Okay, you guys be well. You take care. We will talk next week. Keep your stick on the ice.